The Graham Norton Show has always been a place where Hollywood stars sip cocktails and tell harmless jokes. But throughout its 25-year broadcasting history, no one could have prepared for the shock that occurred on set that Friday night. There were no leaked scripts. There were no glamorous media filters to cover things up. There was only exactly 6 minutes of suffocating silence. Picture this. An angry woman abruptly stands up, grabs her designer bag, and walks off camera in utter humiliation. On the other side of the red sofa, the other person remains seated, absolutely calm, without the slightest hesitation. That was the fiery clash of two completely opposite worlds. On one side was Dame Helen Mirren, the 80-year-old legend who had poured her blood, sweat, and tears for half a century to force the world to bow in respect. On the other side was Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, who stepped into the most powerful family on the planet through a lavish wedding, only to spend all her subsequent time on American television complaining that the place was like a terrible cage. That night, the usually cozy sofa turned into a ruthless judging podium, and a solid verdict was pronounced. Welcome back to the hidden corners of the royals. Before we dissect every second of this historic exposure, let me know your frank opinion. Do you believe that respect is something naturally earned through a title? Please comment number 1. Or is it a reward only for those who dedicate their entire lives with real ability? Please comment number 2. If you are a regular viewer of Friday night entertainment programs, you are certainly no stranger to the atmosphere of the Graham Norton Show. It is like a cozy living room for the elite. That is where Hollywood A-list stars, music legends, and politicians shed their perfect shells. They sit closely together on the famous red sofa, sip a glass of wine, laugh uncontrollably, and tell hilarious behind-the-scenes stories. American audiences love this show precisely because of its authenticity and the zero-distance feeling it brings. Graham Norton, the talented host of the program, is a master at breaking the ice. He can make even the coldest superstars burst into refreshing laughter. But ladies and gentlemen, that evening was a completely different story. The atmosphere in the studio lacked its usual relaxation. Instead, it was more suffocating than ever. An invisible tension, quiet but heavy, crept through every row of the audience even before the cameras officially started rolling. Everyone vaguely realized that the guest arrangement tonight was not just an entertaining conversation. It was like placing 2 blocks of explosives at opposite ends of a room and waiting to see who would light the match. And then, the first character appeared, Dame Helen Mirren. Let us carefully analyze this moment, as it speaks volumes about her entire character. Helen walked onto the stage not with the posture of someone craving flashing lights. She walked with composure, ease, and a warm smile that was completely unforced. The audience immediately applauded wildly, a welcome stemming from absolute respect. She gently sat down on the red sofa, comfortably crossed her legs, and relaxed her shoulders. She did not try to find the best camera angle for her face. Do you know why? Because when you have 50 years of career experience, when you have conquered every peak, from the Royal Theatre stage to the prestigious Oscar Award, you do not need the camera to find you. Naturally, every lens must point towards you. The confidence of Helen Mirren radiates from her very core. To American audiences, those who always worship the dream of hard work and self-made achievements, Helen is the supreme symbol of the concept of earned respect. She did not bring a public relations team to remind her exactly what angle to smile at. She was present there, rustic, sharp, and so authentic that it could not be faked. Her calmness is the most terrifying weapon because it has been forged through decades of facing the toughest scenarios of life. She is a woman who knows her place in this world, and no one can shake that. A few minutes later, the studio door opened again. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, appeared. The contrast at this moment was as clear as day and night. If Helen was the presence of heavy silence, then Meghan walked out with a performance of calculated perfection. She looked gorgeous. Her makeup was flawless, her outfit was perfectly tailored, and a radiant smile was constantly on her lips. The smile we have seen in hundreds of previous interviews. But if you closely observe her body language, you will notice a different story. Every step Meghan took revealed extreme sensitivity to the media lens, a survival skill she honed since her days in Hollywood and upgraded when stepping into the royal family. She slowly walked toward the seat, positioning herself at the furthest corner of the sofa. Why that position? Because, in the visual language of television, sitting at the outermost edge makes it easy for you to turn around, master the perspective, and ensure your frame is never obscured by the person sitting next to you. She sat down, readjusted the hem of her dress, and straightened her back with the standard posture of someone who is media-trained. She is always in a state of readiness to catch the light, but at the same time, it is also a state of high defense. Meghan is like a soldier equipped with armor made of designer brands and radiant smiles. Her confidence is a perfectly crafted product, completely different from the natural, time-proven confidence of the woman sitting at the other end. The audience in the studio and the millions behind the screen could clearly feel that invisible, forced nature. One person walked into the studio like coming home, the other walked in like stepping onto a podium to protect her personal image. The atmosphere right now was like before a major storm. The air was so quiet that you could hear the heartbeats of the people sitting in the front rows. The opposition in value systems between the two women was so immense, so intense, that the red sofa seemed to be stretched tight at both ends. Graham Norton, carrying his familiar stack of question cards, gently stepped to his position in the middle of the seat. As a highly experienced person, he was more than capable of reading the atmosphere in the room. He glanced at Helen with the calmness of an ancient tree. He turned to look at Meghan with her clever defensive posture. Smiling, he looked straight into the camera, shrugged, and dropped a gentle exclamation to break the silence. Well, tonight is going to be a quite interesting show. Graham only intended to say a polite joke to ease the atmosphere. But he had no idea that, in just a few minutes, that joke would accidentally become the most accurate prophecy in his entire television career. The storm had officially converged, and no one in the studio that night could escape its destructive power. Everything began in a seemingly extremely peaceful manner, strictly following the rhythm of a standard television show. After the ice-breaking introduction, Graham Norton smiled, directing attention to the veteran guest. He asked Helen Mirren a question about the BBC documentary project to commemorate the 100th birthday of the late Queen Elizabeth II. The studio audience completely relaxed. They expected a diplomatic answer, the stereotypical words of praise commonly seen from Hollywood actors when mentioning historical figures. But Helen Mirren is not an ordinary Hollywood actor, and her answer was not stereotypical at all. Helen sat up straight, her eyes changing. It was no longer a polite entertainment smile, but an encompassing quiet solemnity. She began to analyze a concept that to modern American society has almost become alien: duty. She spoke in a deep, slow voice, forcing everyone to truly listen. Helen reminded the whole studio that, if she were still alive, Queen Elizabeth would be turning 100 years old. A century of existing in this world, during which there were 70 years, she dedicated entirely to a nation. For us Americans, who are always taught from childhood to pursue our own dreams, to put personal happiness first, the concept of the Queen is a shocking thing. Helen explained that, through decades of research to transform into the character, she realized duty for the Queen was never a burden. It was her entire identity, her DNA. Try to imagine, you wake up every morning for 70 years, and the first thing you are conscious of is that this life does not belong to you. All personal hobbies, all desires, all of your own emotional ups and downs must be set aside to make room for the weight of the crown. There are no sick days for being the symbol of a nation. There is no right to complain. Most of us cannot imagine the magnitude of that sacrifice, Helen concluded, her eyes blazing with a deep respect, so authentic that it made the entire auditorium dead silent. Pay attention to the final key word that Helen just uttered: sacrifice. In behavioral psychology terminology, there are words that act as a trigger word. And for the woman sitting at the other end of the sofa, the word sacrifice was exactly such a switch. Meghan Markle could not sit still. There was an intense subconscious urge forcing her to reshape the story from her own perspective. Because in the worldview of Meghan, no one could be a person who sacrifices more than herself. Even before the lingering effect of the solemnity that Helen created had time to settle, Meghan spoke up. Not harsh, not loud, her tone still carried the perfect shell of softness, but the content was as sharp as a razor blade. Not everyone experiences that institution as a sacrifice, Meghan said, her eyes directed towards Graham instead of looking at Helen. Some people experience it as a cage. With just one sentence, the ideologies of two worlds officially collided in a fiery clash. On one side is the worship of Stoicism, where humans reach greatness by enduring and dedicating themselves to a greater purpose. On the other side is the victimhood mindset, where every rule, every tradition that does not serve the personal ego is considered a restraint, a cage that suffocates freedom. The moment the word cage drifted from the mouth of Meghan, the air in the Graham Norton Show studio seemed to be sucked dry. The temperature dropped abruptly. Hundreds of audience members below shifted slightly. That was the sound of sheer astonishment. The quiet rustling of people who had just realized they were no longer watching an entertainment talk show, but were witnessing an irreversible train wreck. Helen Mirren did not appear shocked. She did not frown. She did not show indignation the way a normal person would when interrupted. Instead, she turned her head. Slowly, deliberately, like a hunter who had locked onto a target. She looked straight into the eyes of Meghan, piercing through that perfect makeup and industrial smile. "Is that so?" Helen asked back, her voice not rising a single decibel. "I have spent many years studying that institution, reading about it, trying to understand its terrible weight. And what I found was a historical complexity, not cruelty." Meghan immediately counterattacked, still holding tightly onto her calm facade. "You studied it from the outside. As for me, I lived in it from the inside." In theory, that was a smart argument. Meghan was trying to use personal experience to strip Helen of her right to speak. She wanted to tell both the United Kingdom and the United States that you are just an actress playing the Queen, while I am the one who actually dined at Windsor Castle. But Meghan had underestimated her opponent. She was playing Go with a grandmaster. The counterblow of Helen landed right after that, without a sound but with absolute lethality. She did not refute that Meghan had lived in the royal family. She only introduced an undeniable variable: time. "For 3 years," Helen replied, articulating every single word. Her tone was flat, cold, and extremely rational. "You lived in it for 3 years. As for me, I have studied it for many decades. I agree that observation and participation bring different perspectives. But my dear, only the persistence of time can provide us with depth." That was a perfect psychological knockout blow. Helen Mirren had just gently stripped away the only weapon of Meghan, a brief 3-year experience, and thrown it into comparison with half a century of relentless work and research. She not only denied the feeling of being locked in a cage of Meghan, she also subtly implied that the dissatisfaction of the Duchess did not come from the cruelty of the royal family, but from her own shallowness, impatience, and un-American lack of effort. The red sofa was now split in half. The match had been lit, and no joke from the host could extinguish the impending explosion. The audience held their breath, waiting to see how Meghan Markle would escape the perfect logical trap that the 80-year-old legend had just laid out. Graham Norton, realizing by now that the program script was slipping completely out of his control, tried to make a desperate effort to salvage the situation. He forced a smile and chimed in, "Well, at least tonight we have both perspectives right here on this sofa." Not a single person laughed. Not a single person moved. The atmosphere was so thick that you could use a knife to cut it. And then, Helen Mirren completely ignored the firefighting words of Graham. She directed her razor-sharp gaze back at Meghan and threw out the million-dollar question, the question that the entire United States and United Kingdom had always wanted to ask, but not a single journalist had the courage to utter right to the face of the Duchess. Helen tilted her head slightly, her voice not carrying a hint of malice or sarcasm. It was purely a curiosity based on sharp, logical thinking. That institution you just called a cage, it is also the launchpad that gave you global attention. It is what elevated you from a television actress to a duchess. It is the name you still carry every single day. So, how can you reconcile constantly criticizing a thing while still pocketing enormous benefits from it? Boom. Ladies and gentlemen, if this were a boxing match, that would be a perfect uppercut. Helen had just hit the most fatal pressure point in the entire Sussex brand, the contradiction between playing an oppressed victim and fully exploiting the royal title to make money. And how did Meghan Markle react? In an effort to salvage her position and pride, she blurted out a sentence that perhaps even now, her public relations team is still holding their heads in regret. Meghan raised her chin, looked straight at Helen and said, "I earned my position through marriage." Let us stop right here. Let us truly stop and think about that statement for 5 seconds. To us American audiences, who always worship the spirit of independence, self-reliance, and honor individuals who rise from empty hands, that statement is no different from media suicide. Meghan was trying to defend herself. She was trying to prove that she deserved to sit in that chair. But ironically, in her panic to protect herself, she accidentally confirmed exactly the point that Helen was drawing out. Earned through a marriage. You do not earn respect by marrying a prince. You are gifted it. That is not self-made power. That is borrowed power. It is borrowed from a man, borrowed from a family, and borrowed from the very cage that she had just eloquently declared as her place of confinement. Helen Mirren, with the sharpness of an experienced old fox, seized that fatal flaw immediately. The studio audience realized it exactly 1 beat slower than her. And what happened next was the most ruthless and quiet psychological dismantling that television history has ever recorded. "Through marriage to a prince," Helen repeated, her voice still maintained at the volume of a living room conversation. And that very calmness was the destructive weapon. That marriage turned you into a part of the institution you are constantly criticizing. The title you hold, Duchess of Sussex, was bestowed by that very institution. The global recognition that allows you to sit on this sofa tonight also comes from that institution. Meghan, now beginning to feel the heat breathing down her neck, hastily rebutted. She leaned forward, maintaining her confident shell. "I have built my own platform since leaving." "Is that so?" Helen asked back. Just 3 words. There was no harshness. There was no malice. There was only the quiet weight of a rhetorical question that inherently contained a fatal answer. Helen began to list, slowly like an auditor reading a financial report. The $100 million contract with Netflix came to you because you are a duchess. The book deal came because you are a duchess. The speaking invitations with huge fees came because you are a duchess. She paused for 1 beat, looked deep into the eyes of Meghan, and delivered the finishing blow to the entire independent facade of her opponent. If we completely strip away that royal label, what do you have left? Dear television audience, ask yourselves that question. If you were Meghan Markle in that very moment, sitting under the bright studio lights, facing a living legend who is seeing right through your soul, and knowing that millions of American viewers are watching through the small screen, how would you answer? Can you name a single great achievement that is not tied to the word royal or the wife of Prince Harry? Meghan did not answer. Not a single substantial answer was given. And the silence that enveloped the studio at that time was not a polite pause. It was a psychological black hole. It was a cold void where an explanation should have existed but was completely empty. You could clearly see the shift on the face of Meghan. Her complexion slightly flushed, her breathing purposely controlled, a desperate bracing of someone trying to keep her mask from cracking right on live broadcast. Helen Mirren did not need to shout to win. She only needed to place a mirror of truth in the right spot and let the silence of her opponent complete the rest of the indictment. In that terrifyingly quiet moment, the entire illusion of an independent, self-reliant woman was stripped away, leaving only the naked truth about a borrowed power desperately trying to cling to the spotlight. The suffocation in the studio at this moment was no longer the awkward feeling of a conversation with differing opinions. It had turned into the suffocating pressure of an interrogation room. When you are pushed into a corner, the most primitive human instinct of self-defense will rise. For Meghan Markle, that instinct was to cling to a version of history she had personally edited. She lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with a fierce defensive streak, and declared, "I was a successful woman long before I met Harry." That was a perfectly designed statement to become a soundbite, a short, catchy quote to go viral on Twitter or TikTok the next morning. A powerful feminist manifesto, but there was a massive problem here. She was sitting across from Helen Mirren, a woman who had spent her entire life reading through the worst scripts in Hollywood. Helen did not interrupt. She let the statement of Meghan hang in the air for a few seconds, long enough for it to reveal its own forced nature. Then, with a flat voice, without the slightest hint of mockery, she began to dismantle that self-made global icon facade. "That is right," Helen calmly nodded. "You were a working actress. You had a regular role on a cable television series. That is a respectable job. Thousands of actors out there would kill to have that position." She leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked onto her opponent, "But you were not a globally famous star. You did not sit on major talk shows to discuss global issues, humanitarian policies, or climate change. That soft power, that immense attention, that global voice, all of those things only came after you stepped into St. George Chapel. Let us be honest about the timeline. American audiences love startup stories, self-made legends. But there is one thing American culture respects even more than success, that is, transparency. You can sell them a dream, but you cannot make them believe in a fake timeline." With 3 clear sentences, Helen erased the attempt of Meghan to bait and switch concepts. She forced the Duchess to face a cruel truth: the success of actress Meghan Markle and the power of the Duchess of Sussex are 2 completely different categories, and she cannot use the former to justify the megalomania of the latter. But Helen did not stop there. Once the illusion of the past was shattered, she redirected her attack straight at the heart of the current brand, the Archewell Foundation. This was the exact moment Helen Mirren abandoned her role as a royal observer to transform into the most ruthless media auditor. In American pop culture, there is an incredibly powerful phrase when you want to expose someone: "Show me the receipts. Show me the evidence." And that is exactly what Helen did on live television. "So, let us talk about the independent foundation you say you built yourself," Helen said, her tone shifting to a cold, logical analysis. "The Archewell Foundation. The heart of your post-royal activities." Meghan blinked slightly, her posture stiffening a bit. She did not foresee this. "I have looked into it," Helen continued. "I have read your website. The design is very beautiful. The words are truly incredibly inspiring. Phrases like activating compassion, building community, driving change. It sounds like a perfect manifesto. Helen paused. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough for Meghan to feel a knife right at her throat. But Helen lightly tapped her fingers on the armrest of the sofa when I tried to look for actual results, when I looked for real lives being changed, real policies being shaped, impacts that can be measured by real numbers, beyond public relations, contracts, and self-righteous speeches. I found absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. At all. The entire studio now shifted from a state of discomfort to extreme shock. Not a single person coughed, not a single person moved. The audience was completely paralyzed. Why was this moment so shocking? Because since leaving the United Kingdom, Meghan Markle had always been enveloped in an absolutely safe media bubble. She sat opposite Oprah Winfrey, a friend who would only nod and empathize. She spoke on friendly podcasts, where scripts were pre-approved to ensure the glorification of her social activist image. No one had ever, not a single host, journalist or guest, dared to look straight into her face on a live television show without a pre-planned script, and bluntly demanded that she prove the actual existence of the charitable empire she was always boasting about. Helen Mirren had just torn that bubble apart. She pointed out a cruel truth that the media had long avoided. There is a massive boundary between using empty words to promote oneself and actually getting hands-on with charity work. Real charity work is messy. It is sweat. It is silent campaigns without flashing lights. It is dry numbers on annual financial reports proving how you used money to change a specific community. As for what Archewell presented, under the razor-sharp perspective of Helen, it was just a paper empire. A flashy coat of paint made of self-aggrandizing terminology created to justify keeping the royal title in order to sign commercial contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. The camera caught a close-up of the face of Meghan. If she really had those receipts, this was the time for her to throw them on the table. This was the time she could boldly list how many schools I have built, how many meals I have provided, how many millions of dollars I have dispersed to medical funds. But Meghan had no answers. Her usual eloquence disappeared. Her eyes briefly showed a desperately hidden panic. She could not list the numbers because they were too small compared to the scale of attention she demanded. The audience did not need to hear any more explanations. The silence of Meghan was the clearest confession. Helen did not convict her. Helen simply placed a math problem on the table, and the truth was that Meghan Markle was completely empty-handed when she could not provide the answer. The image of a global social activist had just been stripped naked, revealing a business model based on resentment and empty rhetoric. If exposing the Archewell Foundation was a sharp knife into the public image of Meghan, then what Helen Mirren did next was the most ruthless indictment aimed at stripping away the ultimate weapon of the Duchess, the victim card. In American culture, we can be forgiving of mistakes, but we are extremely allergic to those who refuse to take responsibility. You cannot throw stones at the window of someone else and then play the victim when they do not open the door to invite you in for dinner. That is a basic rule of life. And Helen Mirren, with the coldness of a seasoned judge, brought that rule onto live television. Helen changed the subject, going straight from the media surface to personal riffs. She brought up an event that had just taken place the previous weekend, the wedding of Peter Phillips, the cousin of Prince Harry. That was an internal, closed, and private family event. There was one detail that the press had uncovered, and everyone knew: Meghan Markle was not present because she was absolutely not invited. When touched upon this pain of ostracization, Meghan immediately turned on her familiar defense mode. She shrugged, her face showing a brief hint of disdain, and called it a smear campaign by the tabloid media, saying the press always wants to create a circus to divide the family. But Helen did not let that sophistry last more than 3 seconds. She looked straight at Meghan, her voice containing no trace of excess emotion. "No, Meghan. That is not the media smearing," Helen articulated every word. "Many reputable sources have confirmed it. The press did not cross your name off the guest list. That family itself did that. The family of your husband did not want you there. Not because they were manipulated by the press, but because they wanted to protect their own peace. What does that tell you?" Meghan, still firmly clinging to her script, replied with the glistening eyes of a wrongfully accused person. "It tells me that the institution has always been hostile towards me." That is a classic answer of the playing the victim syndrome. All faults belong to the system, belong to others, while oneself is always an innocent, oppressed person. But this was not an interview with Oprah Winfrey, where tears are welcomed with a sympathetic hug. This was a confrontation with the truth. Helen sighed lightly. A sigh of understanding human nature, but completely devoid of pity. "Or," Helen said, emphasizing every syllable, "it tells you that your actions have consequences. In life, there is always cause and effect. If you spent 3 years going on American television networks to badmouth the family of your husband, if you brought their most private internal conversations to tell on Netflix, if your husband wrote a memoir, attacking everyone from his brother to his stepmother to rake in tens of millions of dollars, then you cannot expect them to roll out the red carpet to invite you to their wedding. The fact that you are not welcomed is not a bullying campaign. That is the basic self-defense of a family. You sold their secrets for money, so the consequence is that you lose the status of being family." The audience in the studio fell silent. The words of Helen were so sharp that they almost carried physical lethality. It shattered the illusion that Meghan was isolated due to racism or the archaic nature of the royal family. No, she was isolated because of the simplest law of cause and effect that any ordinary American would understand. Selling out your family means being disowned by your family. Backed into a corner, Meghan played her final card. The card she always uses whenever questioned about her privileges, the cruelty of the British press. She complained about how the media scrutinized her, discriminated against her, and destroyed her mental health, saying that no one could understand what it feels like to be hated by an entire media machine. Helen Mirren sat there, listening to all those grievances with a deadly calmness. And then she delivered the final historical indictment. "Do you think that cruelty is reserved only for you?" Helen asked back, her eyes cold and sharp. "The British press is a monster to everyone who steps into that family. Look back at history. They treated Princess Diana terribly, hunting her to the very end. They treated Camilla cruelly, turning her into the most hated woman in England for over a decade, throwing bread at her on the street. They treated Kate Middleton cruelly for many long years, calling her weighty Katie, hacking her phone, secretly taking and distributing her topless photos to smear her." Helen leaned forward, narrowing the gap with Meghan, her voice carrying the weight of a mountain. "That terrible treatment is not your monopoly. Anyone who wears that crown must walk through red-hot fire. The difference does not lie in what the media did to you. The difference lies in how you react to it." The audience was completely drawn into the rapid pace of the arguments. This historical comparison was too comprehensive and irrefutable. Camilla bowed her head, suffered in silence, and worked relentlessly for 20 years to regain respect. Kate Middleton endured, maintained her dignity, and built her image through practical actions. And you? Helen shook her head, a cold judgment enveloping her. You reacted by packaging your pain and selling it to the highest bidder? The smear interview on television was not free. The $100 million Netflix contract is not a charity. The memoir attacking the family brought you tens of millions of dollars. Helen paused. She knew that what she was about to say would be the defining statement of this entire debate, the end of all of the attempts of Meghan to justify herself. "You have commercialized your grievances more successfully than anyone in royal history," Helen concluded, each word falling like a hammer strike. "Do not call it bravery to speak up or seek the truth. That is not honesty. That is commerce. That is not honesty. That is commerce." 8 short words. 8 words that completely stripped bare a $1 million brand. In that moment, Meghan Markle realized that she had no way back. No sophistry could cover up the blatant reality of the lucrative contracts built on the breakdown of a family. The victim card was completely torn apart, leaving only the nakedness of a business deal exploiting the royal reputation. When the phrase "that is not honesty, that is commerce" rang out and echoed in the studio space, the only thing left was a suffocating silence. Not a single whisper from the audience. Not a single forced smile from the host, Graham Norton. That was a moment any behavioral psychology expert could recognize, the complete collapse of a facade. When logic is broken, when beautiful sophistries about compassion and bravery are exposed as a lucrative business model, people lose their calmness. And Meghan Markle, the woman who always prided herself on her ability to control her perfect image, officially reached her breaking point. The mask of a patient and vulnerable duchess disappeared, replaced by the explosive narcissism of an ego backed into a corner. Her eyes darkened, her lips pressed tightly together. She leaned forward, no longer maintaining her initial elegant posture. With a cold, sharp tone, full of disdain, Meghan threw out a sentence aimed at lowering the position of her opponent. "I will not sit here to be interrogated by an actress." An actress. She used the word actress as an insult, a way of saying that you are just an entertainer on screen, while I am true royalty. You have no right to question me. But ladies and gentlemen, using a profession to attack Helen Mirren was a suicidal mistake. The atmosphere in the studio at this moment felt like it was about to catch fire. We American audiences love a counterattack, and Helen delivered a finishing blow so ruthless that it could be put into textbooks on the art of debate. Helen did not even blink. She did not blush with anger. She just tilted her head slightly, offering a faint smile, the smile of a general watching the enemy walk themselves into a minefield. She replied, word by word, as clear as the rhythmic strike of a hammer. "That is right. An actress. An actress who won an Oscar for transforming into the very grandmother-in-law that you are constantly criticizing. An actress who spent decades studying and understanding the history of that family more deeply than anything you have ever experienced. And most importantly," Helen paused for a beat, her eyes as sharp as a razor blade. "An actress who earned the title of Dame herself through 50 years of relentless artistic labor, through true sweat and talent, not through a marriage certificate." The difference between earned and given had never appeared so clear and cruel. The audience in the studio let out a suppressed gasp. It was not an insult, but an undeniable truth. The self-made power of Helen completely crushed the fragile borrowed power of Meghan. But Helen Mirren did not stop there. When the defensive wall of Meghan had collapsed, Helen took another step forward, delivering the final psychological blow with a question that dug deep into the greatest human fear: rejection. She looked straight into the eyes of Meghan, her tone suddenly losing its sarcasm, replaced by a cold sharpness. "You constantly talk about being a victim, about being stripped of your voice, about millions of people listening to you. But be honest with yourself for a moment, Meghan. Who actually wants you?" Meghan froze. That question pierced through every media script. Helen continued to analyze, not giving her opponent a second to breathe. "Millions of people watch your documentary on Netflix. Millions of people buy the book of your husband. But do not confuse curiosity with respect. Do not confuse being watched with being wanted. People watch your show the way they slow down to look at a traffic accident on the highway, out of curiosity, at a wreckage. But being wanted means being invited to the dinner table. It means being welcomed by family. It means being welcomed with open doors by the true elite of Hollywood instead of them keeping their distance. So look around you. Who invites you? Who misses you when you are absent? Who truly wants your presence for who you are, and not for the royal title you are exploiting? The silence lingered. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. 7 seconds. In that terrifyingly quiet space, the answer appeared all too cruel: absolutely no one. The royal family had closed its doors. The American A-list elite maintained a cautious silence to avoid scandal. Even old friends were gradually distancing themselves. Meghan Markle understood that she had lost. Lost completely. There would be no media smile that could salvage the truth that had just been exposed on this sofa. And so, instead of facing it, her instinct to escape arose. Meghan stood up abruptly. Her movements were stiff and rushed. She reached out, grabbing the designer handbag placed next to her. That act of grabbing the bag happened so fast, lacking the calmness and elegance she had always painstakingly cultivated. She threw back an angry but helpless look, then turned on her heel and walked straight toward the backstage door. The sound of her heels pounding on the studio floor echoed rapidly, fading away and then disappearing behind the closed door. Do not confuse that walk with the head-held high resistance of a wrongfully accused woman. To the millions of viewers glued to the screen, that was not a glorious exit. It was a fleeing. It was the humiliating retreat of someone who realized her fallacious arguments had been broken piece by piece, and continuing to sit there would only further reveal the emptiness inside the flashy attire of the Duchess. Meghan had left. But the shadow of the cruel truth that Helen Mirren had just outlined still sat there, filling the empty space on the red sofa, imprinted deeply into the minds of the entire American audience. The studio door closed, taking away the silhouette of the Duchess of Sussex, and leaving behind a terrifyingly quiet space. The red sofa was now half empty. Graham Norton, a veteran host who had never run out of words in his 25-year career, now just stared at the question cards in his hands. He looked over at the other guests, then looked down at the audience rows, softly clearing his throat. No one knew what to say. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the kind of silence that only appears when a truth so massive and so cruel has just been exposed, and everyone needs time to digest its weight. Amidst the astonishment of the entire studio, Helen Mirren remained seated. She calmly smoothed the folds of her dress, her demeanor completely undisturbed. There was no triumphant smile of someone who had just won an argument. There was no gloating. On the contrary, her eyes contained a deep contemplation. She politely apologized to Graham for interrupting the flow of the program. But Graham, with his astuteness, replied with a statement that represented all of us. You did not interrupt anything. You just clarified everything. And then, Helen asked permission to say one final word. She did not turn to the host, but looked straight into the camera lens, speaking directly to the millions of viewers sitting in front of the small screen. She raised her voice, warm and steadfast. She said that she was not speaking up for herself, but she represented the voice of the silent crowd out there. She represented ordinary, hard-working citizens, those who always place their faith in the values of dedication, loyalty, and discipline. Helen spoke of the heartbreak of having to stand and watch the massive legacy of the late Queen, a legacy built with blood, tears, and 70 years of sacrificing her personal ego, being ruthlessly attacked in the press. What made millions of people indignant, according to Helen, was not the fact that the royal family was criticized. It was the ingratitude The ultimate ingratitude when someone happily accepted all the most lavish privileges, the largest global launchpad from a family, only to turn around and bite the very hand that lifted them up, and call it bravery. Helen emphasized, "I fired back for the people out there. Those who love dedication and feel completely helpless with no way to respond to those smearing schemes." She was right. Absolutely right. The next morning, the United States and the whole world woke up to an unprecedented media earthquake. There was no editing from the network. That entire 6-minute clip exploded on every social media platform. Millions of shares, thousands of analytical articles. And the strange thing was, no massive public relations team of the Sussexes could extinguish this fire. Why did the words of Helen have such terrifying destructive power? Why did it touch the very depths of the hearts of us American audiences? The answer lies in its uncompromising authenticity. We are living in an era where every statement from a celebrity must go through the filter of dozens of lawyers, of million-dollar public relations contracts, and the extreme fear of cancel culture. Everyone is afraid of misspeaking. Everyone is afraid of offending a certain group of people. But Helen Mirren stands outside all those invisible laws. She is 80 years old. She is a living legend. She has enough wealth, enough respect, and a solid position to the point where she does not need to grovel to please any social media algorithm. Most importantly, she has nothing to lose. When a woman with a 50-year career and no longer bound by fame and fortune decides to speak up, her words carry the weight of a mountain. Helen did not try to create a gimmick. She simply used a surgical scalpel, tearing open the shell of hypocrisy and megalomania, to speak the naked truth that all of us, the silent audience, had always thought about for a long time, but lacked a platform to boldly state it. That night, media justice was truly served. Ladies and gentlemen, the red sofa that night did not just witness a debate on television. It was a cruel mirror reflecting two completely opposite sides of the coin of fame. On one side is true power, built with 50 years of sweat, patience, and proven talent. On the other side is a frivolous attention, gained from exploiting a centuries-old legacy and commercializing personal grievances. In this life, there are people willing to dedicate their entire lives to quietly proving their worth through actions. And there are also people who just pass by, taking away the most quintessential privileges, only to leave behind a mess of playing the victim. That night, Helen Mirren did not just protect the legacy of a queen. She represented the collective voice of our community, people belonging to a generation that always cherishes the value of true labor, silent people who are so tired of the modern media culture that only knows how to glorify meaningless noise. As for you, what do you think about the true boundary between being respected and merely being noticed? Please leave your perspective right down in the comments section. Do not forget to press the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the most authentic historical and social hidden corners. Goodbye and see you in the next video.